Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Bill of Rights Institute's Primary Source Close Read, where we are walking you through really important primary sources in U.S. history. I'm Mary Patterson. I am the Senior Specialist of Content here at the Bill of Rights Institute, and today I am joined by my colleague and BRI's Senior Fellow, Tony Williams.
Hi, Mary. How are you?
I'm great, Tony. How are you doing?
Great.
So today we are going to be taking you through Harry Truman's Truman Doctrine address, which he gave to a joint session of Congress on March 12th, 1947. So if you checked out our close read of Winston Churchill's Sinews of Peace address, we are about a year forward in time. And Harry Truman, President Truman, was present as Winston Churchill gave that address, where he talks about the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain and the British Empire, and their pivotal role in setting up the free world after World War II. And he talks about this Iron Curtain and the Soviet menace. And of course, Truman is there. He's in the audience as Churchill is giving that speech. And then he's addressing Congress now with this very famous address that comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine. So, Tony, is there anything else that we should know for context or background before we dive into what Truman had to say?
Yeah, I think there's some important things to consider. Truman of course, has been president for a few years now. He took over. He was vice president under FDR and became president when FDR died in April of 1945, right at the end of the war, and then led America through the final defeat of Nazi Germany and then Imperial Japan during the summer of 1945. And he took over a lot of the statesmanship from FDR, and so went to Potsdam, one of the final wartime summits conferences, and had to make a lot of decisions that shaped the post-war world. And he was faced with an increasingly hostile Soviet Union, right? So this Cold War develops, and I think a few facts, particularly for specifically for this, are important. The Soviet Union, in American eyes, in Truman's eyes, and several policymakers' eyes, is becoming increasingly hostile, increasingly aggressive. A couple of examples, it's taking a firm control over Eastern Europe, as we explored in our Churchill conversation. The Soviet Union also is looking towards the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and has troops in northern Iran, which it refuses to evacuate because it wants to establish a presence in the Middle East, a military one. Eventually, it does withdraw those after the Truman administration gets tough with the Soviet Union. But they're also demanding control over the Straits of the Dardanelles near Turkey, which are controlled by Turkey. They're fostering the communist parties throughout Western Europe. There's a great deal of devastation, as we mentioned in our Churchill conversation. There's physical devastation. The economies of Europe are shattered. There's millions of displaced persons throughout the continent. There's starvation and hunger. The people of Europe are really, really suffering at the end of World War II. And into that vacuum comes a pretty aggressive communist parties controlled, by Moscow. And Stalin forms the Common Forum to direct those efforts and fund those efforts. And so, and there's a Greek war, there's a civil war in Greece in which, the communists are fighting for control there. So, as Truman is looking at the world in 1946, 1947, he sees an increasingly hostile Soviet Union, and one that's trying to, one that has taken control over Eastern Europe, but one that's trying to spread its influence, whether ideologically, through parties throughout Western Europe, militarily, financially, ideologically, etc. So they are really trying to expand their influence. And Truman and other policymakers in the United States decide that they can't allow that.
Okay, and I think we talked about this in our discussion of the Sinews of Peace address, but the destruction, like you just mentioned in Europe, I think, again, it's difficult for now, and certainly then, for people living in the United States to understand that. So World War I and World War II were fought in Europe, and they're just devastated, just in it, like, people are starving because there's no food. And it's just, again, we had no concept of that. So talk about desperation and, you needing some help, and who can you turn to? You have the Soviets coming in, and then can we offer them some sort of alternative?
Right, and I think it is those are great points, and really important to note just how exhausted Europe was, right? And there was a real sense of disillusionment, and it's very noted by a lot of teachers in after World War One, and the writers and all the disillusionment, but civilization itself seems exhausted by the end of World War II. I mean, they've had 20 to 30 years of just almost nonstop war and fascism and totalitarianism, and I think it's a largely forgotten set of facts about that devastation that are really important not to forget.
And here in the text of what Truman is saying to this joint session of Congress is it's the gravity of this situation. So it's a very serious time. And it's not just foreign policy, but he says it's our own national security as well, which I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so we mentioned the Greek Civil War and also the Soviet threats against Turkey. It's also really important to note that the British had appealed to the Americans, and they said, look, because they were the ones largely responsible for that area, with that line kind of spreading throughout the British Empire over to India. And the British told the Americans, we don't have the wherewithal anymore to handle the financial and military burden of this, and you have to take it over. Otherwise, the situations will deteriorate and collapse, and the Soviet Union will expand into those areas in a very significant and dangerous way. And so, the question that Truman and his advisors had to face is, will the United States take over those commitments? Will it sort of be the leader of the free world, if you will? Did it have the wherewithal? Did it have the resources? And did it have the historical mind to want to do that? Did this break with tradition? This is something we'll talk about, I'm sure, throughout the speech. But these are really important considerations. What are the purposes of American foreign policy? And is it to be the leader of the free world?
Great, and I think, so again, the British turning to the United States to say we can't do this anymore is because they're so devastated by the war. Right? They're still on their wartime rations into the 50s. They're wrecked, really. And we spoke about this with Churchill's Sinews of Peace. Britain is sort of the junior partner, and like the mantle or the torch is passing if the United States is willing to take it. And Truman answers that question, I think, at the bottom here. I don't believe that the American people and the Congress wish to turn a deaf ear to the appeal of the Greek government. So I think the question is the United States ready for this shift in our role in the world? And Truman seems to be saying, well, yeah, I think we are. I think the people are, and the Congress, the people in their Congress.
Right, and these are pretty new trends, right? For centuries since the founding, the United States has largely taken the view that they're going to be a model of freedom for the world, but not physically spread that or spread it through arms, and that they would have no sort of entangling alliances, as Jefferson and also Washington said. And, largely we follow the Monroe Doctrine. So we, defended our interests in the Western Hemisphere and largely left Europe to govern their own affairs. This changes a bit during World War I, actually pretty dramatically, as Wilson argues that we were fighting to, quote unquote, make the world safe for democracy, right? And so spreading our ideals through strategic means, through warfare. And FDR spoke in a lot of the same language that Truman is speaking in terms of the U.S. commitment to the free world and having responsibilities to defend those principles against the forces of totalitarianism, whatever form they might take. And so, Truman is following in this strain of sort of 20th century foreign policy thought that says, with the rise of American power comes these great responsibilities for leading the free world, and that we would, as Kennedy would later say, bear that burden.
Mm-hmm. And he mentions down here, so again, he's saying the British government just can't handle this anymore. And there's the United Nations now, which is formed after World War II to try to mitigate situations like this. But the United Nations can't help either, according to Truman. Like it's ours to do something if we are willing to do it.
It's 2 years old. I mean, the UN is still figuring out its mission and how it's going to accomplish that, and how do you get the forces to support their policies from various nations. The Soviet Union and their allies, either through force or not. They have a veto. The Soviet Unions have a veto in the Security Council. So. So the UN is struggling, I think, to define itself, and I think Truman understands that they're just not in a position to resolve the crises around the world, and that he believes the United States has to be the one to step in and do it, because the older powers of the world, such as Great Britain, they can't do it either. It's really going to be up to one of the two superpowers, the United States, to face off against the other world superpower.
So in this part of his speech, he's directly talking about the objective of foreign policy. So one of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion. So Tony, you mentioned before that foreign policy in the United States, it's changed. If you think about George Washington's famous farewell address, which we also step you through in another primary source close read, it was just this idea of beware entangling alliances. That's not what the United States is about. And here, what Truman is proposing it is a very different role for the United States and how we've really changed over time and what our responsibilities are.
Right. Yeah, it becomes a very sort of internationalist foreign policy, and one that, again, now we're creating the conditions in which other nations will be able to live free from coercion. And that may have been necessary, but, during World War II, after World War II. But it's certainly a shift, right? That we're not going to just promote world peace. We're not going to be a city upon a hill, but we will actually help create the conditions for freedom to thrive. It's a very different and very expansive obligation.
Oops, pushed the wrong key here. Okay, I skipped over one. So again, the goal here is to, as you said, create these conditions where the will of the majority and free institutions, representative government, free elections, where these things can actually happen. And they're not going to happen in a place where people are starving or there's no roads, there's so much death and destruction and displacement that people are desperate and they'll turn to what's there. And if the communist, the Red Army and Stalin's minions are there and offering something or forcing something upon them, then this is the second way of life that he's describing here, then the United States should do something. is what it's
Right,
trying
and
to.
yeah, and I think you see a real clear moral vision. In many ways, it's even more starkly put than Churchill did in the Sinews of Peace speech. Um, but he's very clear. This is what the free world is based upon: majority rule, free institutions, representative government, free elections, individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, freedom from oppression. Again, however imperfectly applied. But the second way of life, the communist way, or other totalitarian systems, the will of a minority imposed upon the majority, right? Certainly the Eastern Europeans would understand that. It relies upon terror and oppression, a police state, right? The KGB, a controlled press, radio. There's no freedom of the press, right? There's no free speech. There's really no elections, and when they're held, they're fixed. And the suppression of personal freedoms in a liberal system. And so, he's painting a picture for Congress, because he's delivering the speech there, and for the American people broadly, that these are the options, right? The free world versus the communist world. And obviously he's saying we have a responsibility to the free world, and really we want to promote those ideals in the first way of life around the world to all people. In fact, Truman would have said he hoped that the Soviet people could enjoy those things as well.
Mhm.
Those are good and fundamental truths for human nature, and better suited to them than the second half.
I think in this last piece here, right, he's basically saying, he outright says it. He's very clear, like as you said, option one, the American way of doing things, however imperfectly applied. Of course, the United States has a lot of problems too in 1947. But when you contrast it with the other option, it's like a no-brainer. It's no contest. So it's the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And we should do this through economic and financial aid. Because if people, again, if the desperation, the wreckage of Europe after World War II has to be addressed. So sort of like your hierarchy of needs, so you can have this orderly political process that he's describing here.
Yeah, Mayor, I think that's absolutely right. He's appealing here for economic, for financial aid. I think it's shrewd of him. While economic and financial aid could solve those problems, that Americans don't want another war, right? So Truman is very careful not to couch this in military terms. We've demobilized from World War II. People are not eager to fight another major war. And so, he's telling Congress, telling the American people that economic, financial aid will suffice for this point. And I think that's a smart appeal on his part.
So does this policy, it passes with bipartisan support?
Yeah, it really does. There is a really important Republican senator named Arthur Vandenberg who works with Truman on a lot of these policies. He actually, they're the main architects of the Truman Doctrine in many ways. Also, eventually they work together on the Marshall Plan. And, Vandenberg is helping Truman get a lot of his Cold War policies through Congress, specifically through the Senate, because there is a pretty good amount of Republican opposition to it, led by Senator Robert Taft from Ohio. He helps lead sort of the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, and they're very wary about the military spending and the worldwide obligations. They want to return to an isolationist kind of foreign policy. And Truman and Vandenberg, as well as many others, but Truman relies on him in Congress to help get these policies passed. So it's a great, in many ways, bipartisan, cooperative venture from people in different parties. Something you don't normally see too much today, and
Yeah.
maybe that's a good story there and a good lesson for us to reach out to the other side a little more often.
But I do think it's interesting that, I mean, it's worth pointing out that there was opposition to this. And I think I think that's part of the American way too, that it's a discussion and a conversation, and it's not one way or the highway. And that also makes, because we talked about, continuity and changes in American foreign policy with this speech, but also it makes me think of, after World War I and trying to ratify the Versailles Treaty and how the opposition there, and very partisan, but just this idea of what is the role of the United States? I think that's a timeless question. That's a question that people still have differing viewpoints on, even in 2020. So
Yeah.
I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, as I said. I'm repeating myself from our last video, but it's interesting to look at these past examples and see how they played out, and remember that not everyone was on board with it, and that there was discussion around it and debate. And I think that's important to be aware of as well, even if this is an example where there was bipartisanship, collaboration.
No, I think you're right. And if you look at our entire Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness book, you'll see that we do address these sort of timeless questions throughout history, these perennial questions. And the purposes of American foreign policy and what our role is in the world, that has been there from the beginning. It's not a question that's going to go away. And as you say, there's been disagreement, but it's been a deliberative process, right? And sometimes we have not agreed and have killed policies like the Versailles Treaty. And other times they work towards supporting a more expansive role in the world. And so, yeah, that deliberative process, those checks and balances, on the presidency and with the Senate, those are all really extremely important and representative of the American system, as you said.
And I think this particular document, it's really a big change in what foreign policy is going to be, but it's not the end of the story, as you said. And you referenced Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, so we hope that you will check that out. That's the Bill of Rights Institute's free online U.S. history textbook, and it's aligned to the AP U.S. history standards. And this particular source you can find there with annotations and questions and vocabulary. If you're interested in checking that out, you should look at mybri.org, click on Educate, or you can look at the link down in the show notes below. Tony, did you have any other concluding thoughts on Harry Truman, or is the book going to stop here?
Well played, Mary. Well played.
Yes, thank you.
Well, it's such an important speech. I really hope students and their students and teachers read this document together and compare it to the farewell address, compare it to the Monroe Doctrine, look at Woodrow Wilson's war message, look at the debate over the Versailles Treaty, and then even later on, Johnson's speeches about Vietnam and Kennedy's inaugural speech. All of that is in Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And so some really great resources to really chew on this idea throughout your study of American history.
So we hope you learned something, and we hope that you will come back and see us again for another primary source close read. Again, you can check out Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Just click on the link in our notes below. And thank you so much for joining us today.